Oh my God.
Welcome, everybody, to ArtiFact number 16. This is going to be an episode where two white guys very slowly and methodically explain racism to you, the audience, here in America. You could get this podcast on Apple, on Google, on Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. There's just a bunch of places. If you are listening to the audio podcast, you could also find these episodes on the Automachination YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Dan Schneider. He wrote this book back in, I believe this was 2005, Show and Tell, A White Man's Antiphonal Primer on Race. Back like 10 years ago when I first read it, I would just print out all the books that Dan and Jessica would send me. And so Dan he's a poet, he's a critic, he's a novelist, he's a short story writer, essayist. And specific to this conversation, he actually grew up in Queens in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, back when it was just a completely different place. Very different from my experiences of Queens right now, living in New York City. In the book, he takes a very interesting strategy that I think is worth kind of exploring, right? Because in the last few years, especially, we've been seeing a lot of kind of rhetoric about when it comes to racism or race, white people need to just kind of sit down and shut up and listen. Whereas Dan Schneider's arguing that even more than blacks in many respects, white people have a special in, right, with race and racism, an understanding of race and racism that really no other people can really find the same in inside, right? Because, I mean, you know, we're the ones, so to speak, that are on top. We are the ones that are creating this problem. And we are the ones that understand psychologically, like why certain things get engaged in and others not. Maybe, Dan, you could sort of give a little summary of the book, any updates you want to do, anything you want to elaborate upon in my introduction.
Well, I mean, like I said, it was written decade and a half or so ago. I think I had an addendum I added after Hurricane Katrina. Basically, recently, this all started with the recent video that came out about the death of this black girl, Ma'Khia Bryant, I think is her name, who was killed a few months ago by this cop, the latest in a series of killings. And I was arguing with people online who were justifying the killing because the girl Ma'Khia had a knife and was trying to stab another girl. And while this guy, the cop, wasn't a Derek Chauvin type, he clearly was remorseful over the having to shoot this girl Ma'Khia. He clearly was poorly trained. He seemingly didn't know anything about how to approach people in this situation. And you know, the basic argument I had with these people was that if this girl had been a white girl in a knife fight or trying to kill another white girl, the cop would never have brought out his gun. And so the basic thesis with that and the book is that racism is, as people have said for many years, is a white person's problem, at least here in the US and probably in Europe, that where the problem with bigotry is always with the bigot, always with the person in power. The people who suffer are just that. They're the people who suffer. So when people talk about, let's talk about racism, and they have all black people on the show, it's kind of superfluous because all you're talking about is the victims, the sufferance. You have to talk about why, whether it's, again, white people in this country or whether it's, you know, if you went to Madagascar, whichever group was in charge, why do people in power almost always in human societies persecute those not in power? And so that's the basic thesis of the book, is to look at the perpetrator, not the victim.
And I want to going to respond to this idea of it being a white person's problem, because this has been twisted in, I guess, somewhat surprising and unsurprising ways, especially in the last few years, that we should probably touch upon. But I just want to sort of start with this quote as the book opens. This is in the middle of the first page. This is a question that you say that you were crafting as a teenager when you first started thinking about race. why are virtually all of the books and or monographs regarding the idea of race in America focused upon the problems, needs, or sufferings of Black people? This query has been with me since I read my first books on the subject as a child in the local library, long before political correctness reared its ugly head. Yet few other people, much less kids my own age, seem to even think it was a query, much less attempted to answer it. And by it, I do not mean that it should focus on the problems, needs, or sufferings of other minority groups. Rather, I mean, why isn't the aim of the query directed the other way? To understand why racism is a problem, one must deal with the source of the problem, not the target nor end result. Racism in America, historically and by and large, has been white America's problem, usually born of fear and merely the burden of Blacks and other groups. And I thought that was a great quote, especially near the end, usually born of fear and merely the burden of Blacks and other groups, right? Because, it seems like when you walk around and you see even just kind of like basic interactions between white people and Black people, especially when white people are sort of nervous being in settings that they're not used to, you definitely do get the sense that Black people and minorities in general, they do have to deal a lot, right, in terms of just like cultivating patience, like seeing like a tiny little sort of misbehaviors, fears, and sort of knowing that they're the ones that are responsible for it, despite the fact that they're not actually doing anything to engender this kind of response. And I think because of this fact, in the last few years, there's been this very weird movement in like, I guess, like racism discourse called anti-racist theory. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but most recently there's this woman, Robin DiAngelo. She's a white woman. She wrote this book called White Fragility, which does sort of, make the argument that white people, they're not only privileged, but just psychologically, they're very unwilling to admit privileges and they're very willing to admit their role in racism. But instead of kind of leaving the analysis there, she's trying to understand racism as a white person from a white perspective by essentially encouraging white people to engage in the worst kind of, white liberal guilt imaginable, right? Instead of actually doing things that are worthwhile, it's all very kind of, melodramatic and performative. It's pay me money, I'm going to show up, to you for dinner, and, we're going to eat, and I'm going to teach you how to not be a racist. Or it's, if you are the owner of a company, you do all these kinds of like pointless diversity trainings or anti-racist trainings. And it always strikes me as, after a while of sort of dealing with this as a white person and seeing how racism gets discussed, it doesn't really do anything to assuage your guilt, right? Because essentially you're still not engaging any behaviors that change anything that's going on. I mean, like at a bottom line, like you need some sort of redistribution scheme, you need top-down policies, and none of that's really happening with these conversations. And in fact, for all of racism being in the public sphere right now, everything is being done to prevent actual changes from occurring, even if like they're being paid lip service to. I'm not sure if you have any comments about that specifically, like how race has been used by Democrats or just by people in general the last few years, especially.
Well, getting back to this woman that you mentioned, this is one of the basic problems. You're not going to change, forget even Trumpers, because Trump people are so far out. The bigger problem is people in structural in corporations. How do you promote Black people from within? I just looking at that quote you had for me there, that I had a corollary question always with us: why do whites fear so much? And it's basically a precursor to this idea of white privilege. Is that look at here in COVID. I mean, it's mostly white people who don't want to wear masks. They didn't want to wear masks. They have prolonged, in this country at least, this current medical crisis, because it's too goddamn big of a thing to ask you to just wear a fucking mask. I've worked hard labor through this whole crisis, and I wear a mask. Don't tell me you can't go walk down to your local deli or your local McDonald's and wear a fucking mask. But they have that privilege. if you're going driving in a car and you're pulled over and the sirens go. Now I get nervous by that, but if I were black, I'd be really nervous about that. And you know, the simple way to do it is just act normal around most people. I was just recently arguing with these couple of idiots on Quora about skin color of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens and the whole out of Africa theory. And I ended up with two people arguing against two people. One was this black guy, I presume, he didn't have a photo, but who's arguing about the whole black Egyptians nonsense, which has been debunked.
Yeah, we should talk about that. Yeah,
which has been thoroughly debunked. And then on the opposite side, this white woman from Finland who thinks that white was the default. So you have this woman from Finland.
Default out of Africa, like in Africa, they were white coming out.
She thinks that humans that evolved in Africa were white, and then they devolved to become dark skinned. And then this other black Egyptians nut thinks that he doesn't understand that, for example, most Neanderthals were lighter skinned than the Africans who came into Europe. So Homo sapiens, when they came in to kill the Neanderthal, they were the darkest skinned human beings, killed most of the Neanderthals. And this guy will use a link to say, oh, they found some darker melanin in some Neanderthal sites in Indonesia, because we're not talking about Indonesian Neanderthals, and here and there in Europe. And I'm like, yes, just like there's many skin tones in modern humans, clearly Neanderthals had a variety of skin tones. Not everyone is literally as black as spades or as white as a swan. And then, like I said, the other woman is. But I dismissed the black Egyptians idiot just as easily as I dismissed the white racist idiot. And I think I mentioned to you before, wherever I've worked, especially in blue collar and work situations, at every job I've ever had, whatever black people are there, they'll come and sit. When they sit with me on a break, they'll start talking to me, because if someone's an idiot, I don't care if they're black or white, I'll call them an idiot. But most white people, especially white liberals, if this was a black guy who was talking this black Egyptians nonsense, they'd be like, I've never thought about that. I mean, you make such good points. I mean, I'll have to look up on that. Whereas I know that it's bunkum that's been debunked, and the only people who promote that stuff are History Channel buffs, and the History Channel is not about history.
Yeah, I remember watching. This was maybe about a year ago. It was like some conference, classical music, and they were involving black musicians, black composers, and just like black speakers. And there was this one part that just like really I hate when I see this, because it's kind of like liberals are trying to have it both ways. So there was this black guy, and he was arguing that, you think, the apex of classical music was Beethoven and Mozart and, whoever. Actually, if you go back further in history, there's been great classical music, coming out of Africa. And it's like, on the one hand, liberals try to make the correct assertion that Africa has been exploited, right? And due to, various geographical factors that were covered by Jared Diamond and Guns, Germs, and Steel, Africa could simply never develop as quickly as Europe or as Asia. And if that is the reality, you cannot have a situation where you have an apex of classical music, right, coming out of Africa. It's literally not going to happen. On the other hand, if you have exploitation of an entire continent, and this African diaspora in America and elsewhere now, you're not going to have kids for very obvious reasons. Why aren't black kids in classical music? Well, the most obvious reason is, if you're a poor person living in like housing projects or something, you're not going to buy a fucking violin, right? You're not going to have money for that kind of thing. You're not going to have money for lessons. And yet there's this kind of need to emphasize this idea of like, well, my personal ancestral history was actually full of either kings or great achievements and accomplishments, and it gels neither with reality nor with the broader argument that liberals try to make about how power gets negotiated and used and misused and abused throughout history. And it's like these like extremely confused arguments that are just they're counter arguments to their kind of deeper abiding philosophy. And it's very kind of annoying to watch. And another thing that you mentioned in this book that I didn't really think about is whenever people talk about stuff like we used to be kings, right? There's a meme going around now, we was kings, right? Where you have all these like really improbable scenarios for Black Africans in the past. But if you are so emphatic that this is your personal history, that is because you have never been able to transcend, the trappings of power and how this is interpreted by the white world. It's the white world that says civilizations have to be big and powerful and able and willing to exploit others. If you are uncomfortable with that fact, you shouldn't be trying to emphasize the same thing in your past as if this is a boon to anything, because it's not, right?
Well, just with the classical music, that there's a meme going around that Beethoven was Black.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, or you get variations of this kind of thing all the time, right? Whether it's sexuality or now it's race is kind of more faddish, right? So it used to be Shakespeare was gay. Now people don't really care too much about that, especially since he's still a white man. Now it's Beethoven had to be Black, right, or whatever.
Well, the whole "We Were Kings" meme directly got started with Roots, the TV miniseries in 1977, where Alex Haley's answer that, you were born of, and there's a famous scene, where you were born of kings. And of course, you know that the reason to do that is you want your people have been oppressed. You want to say that. It's the same motivation that a lot of Native Americans have taken, that, they have embraced in a lot of ways this noble savage myth that we were all better than the white people and whatnot, even though you can look back and they wiped out the large mammals of North America when their ancestors came. They especially civilizations like the mound builders. It's probable that a lot of what the mound builders did had ecological consequences, just like with a lot of the American Indians in Mesoamerica and South America, that they caused a lot of the problems, just like the Easter Islanders. There's the whole idea about trying to battle bigotry is not to say, oh, you say my group is the worst, I'm saying it's the best. It's to say that on a broad sense, most human groups are fairly equal. Yes, people are equal, supposed to be here in the U.S., equal under the eye of the law. But if you can play chess better than me, if I can shoot basketball better than you, and a third guy can beat both of us, and a fourth guy is worse than both of us, that's just reality.
Yeah.
James Emanuel, this great poet, American poet, that for decades, the last 20 plus years I've championed. When you put forth bad artists simply because of who they are or what they are, that makes the great artists who have those same qualities, whether it's gender or sexual identity or religion, that tokenizes them, and that demeans the people who have really accomplished anything. I was just talking yesterday. I did an interview on my Dan Schneider video interview with this fellow about this sporting life, and we briefly got talking about Simone Biles, the Olympic gymnast, a young Black girl who's considered like the best gymnast now, if not of all time, at least for females. And she sat out the stuff so that she could promote that the fact that she was sexually abused, and sexual abuse is rampant there, and that's all well and good. And people have either taken these extremes that oh, she's really courageous, or that she has been kind of selfish in that she may or may not have told her teammates or whatnot. But this is a binary kind of thinking. In some ways, it is a selfish act, but it's also a good act if this is what she chose to do. But here in Texas, I think it was a Texas state senator who really had something racist about Simone Biles. And it's like, okay, this is a young woman. She's talking about being sexually abused. You can say it's the right form or whatnot, but the fact that she's Black has nothing to do with the sexual abuse. But here again, this is some Yahoo here in Texas who is shooting his mouth off, injecting race into something where there's no race involved. I mean, the Simone Biles.
Are the rates of sexual abuse different for like Blacks versus whites?
I don't know about within gymnastics. I don't know.
Probably gymnastics. But
the point is, Simone Biles' dark brown skin is utterly irrelevant to the fact that some scumbag was molesting apparently for 20 years in I guess, at this Bella Karolyi, who was a famous Russian gymnast teacher. He apparently was running a pedophile school, and it was abusing lots of girls, probably white, black, Asian, whatever. But you always have these people that, if they disagree with you, will look for the thing that is different from them and use that. It's like if you were overweight and I was arguing, they said, "You fat son of a bitch." Well, that has nothing to do with your being overweight. Has nothing to do with the wrongness of the argument, but it's just a cheap way to inject vitriol where you can't argue intellectually.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we could differentiate our perspectives, even though we're on the left, both from other leftists as well as conservatives, especially, isn't the fact that I'm sure you and I have the following belief: if you give white people or black people or Native Americans or whoever an opportunity to do the kind of thing that white people have done throughout history, of course you're going to take it, right? Because if you're going to accept that human beings are human beings across the board, and you reject the noble savage myth, whether it has to do with pastoral people or whether it has to do with, just like different races or whatever, that everybody has an equal chance of misbehavior. But when conservatives make that argument, and it is technically a correct argument, they want to simply leave it at that, and they want to use that in kind of exculpatory fashion when it comes to white people. Like, oh, you would have done the same thing. You would have also been, a slaver, which is obviously in Africa, right? Most people that were entangled in the slave.
It's the Ted Bundy argument. Ted Bundy, porno made me do it. It's an easy argument. That really Bundy wasn't admitting it. He's trying to say he was a victim, and all power corrupts, and we just happen to stumble into it as white people. And you can look at Fidel Castro. You can look at Duterte in the Philippines. You can look at all of the banana republic dictators in South America and Africa over the last 50 years since colonialism started ending. But so what? So what? That doesn't excuse every U.S. president since Washington basically in one form or another condoning and committing some form of mass murder. Now, yes, some of them were obvious racist. Andrew Jackson comes to mind. Some of them were obviously not all there. Nixon and Kissinger come to mind. Oddly enough, Donald Trump, for all of his flaws, was probably in the last 50 or 100 years, probably the president least responsible for deaths overseas, although he certainly made up for that here domestically.
Yeah. And just like to finish that earlier point, so like if the conservative argument is, well, you would have done it if you had the chance, they want to leave the issue at that, right? And meaning like now, because of this fact, because you would have done this too, there's nothing to do any longer. Whereas our position is going to be closer to something like, well, yes, it's true that black people would have enslaved whites if they had the chance, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, like, we don't have those, other possibilities in place historically. What happened was, this was the white role in the world. And now, because of this fact, because this is history, it is time to do some sort of remediation, right? It's time to make some kind of changes. So conservatives are not willing to go there, and liberals are not willing to start with the assumption, essentially, and this is kind of, it's ironic, right? But liberals are not willing to start with the assumption that all people are more or less the same across the board and will behave the same in similar circumstances.
Well, quote liberals, and I say quote liberals, I mean, the one thing I would disagree, I don't know if the positions that we have are really leftist. I would say they're center left. They're not on that. I mean, when you have 60+% of people in favor for eliminating college debt, in favor of Medicare for all, in favor of the Green New Deal or something better, et cetera, all of these so-called left-wing ideas, if you're getting 60 or 70% support time and again for the last 4 or 5 years, I don't see how you can say that that's really leftist. I mean, people say this is a center-right country. No, I think ultimately we have probably a moderate to center-left country. The problem is the center-left, they don't want to stand up. Whatever you can say about the Donald Trumps or about racists or the Tucker Carlson, what, these guys don't give a fuck. And you just look at someone like Biden. He's done the minimum that he needs to do to appeal to classical liberals or whatnot. But now with this budget stuff, he should just fucking go to reconciliation. Fuck this shit. We're gonna do this, but liberals don't want to upset the apple cart, or people, they don't want to see. Not that Biden is really a liberal, but they don't want to do that. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to make the big systemic changes that are needed. And we can talk all about racism, but one of the things that's well, I don't want to get off on global warming. You just see, I mean, no matter what's going on, they're not taking it seriously. They don't take it seriously. Anyway.
I don't think just, it's a short aside, but I think people are really kind of underestimating what's happening, collectively, right? So like, the Paris Accords were supposed to be this kind of, it's this like opt-in system that does the bare minimum. Last time that I checked, I think countries have hit like 10% of their milestones. So literally like nothing is happening, right? 10% is nothing. And people don't understand what this really means. Like to live in a 4 degrees of warming means, again, everything south of Montreal is an uninhabitable desert, with the exception of like, I don't know, Patagonia or some shit like that. People don't really get that, or what needs to be done, right, for that to actually be averted.
Take a look. Talk about white privilege. I saw something just 2 or 3 days ago. That idiot Elon Musk, who's been sending himself into space, he's more concerned with he said something literally that he just had a baby with his girlfriend, that we need to more people on this planet. This is the only kind of thing that some detached white supposed liberal thinker could think of, that any real climate scientist will tell you one of the biggest things we could do is to reduce population. It was 3 billion 50 years ago when they talked about the population explosion. Here it is, over 2.5 times many people on the planet, and they're still not taking it seriously. Now, it's true that scientific projections say 20 to 40 billion people could survive on this planet if everything was run well, if things were equally distributed. Mm-hmm. But because of bigotry, we don't have that. We have you can't have the rest of the world get up to our standard the way we live so wastefully here in this country. That will just destroy the planet. And it may not make it Venus, but it could very well do it. But we don't plan about it. We don't care about it. People like Musk, they live in this fantasy world. California should be borrowing from Israeli technology and desalinating water. But anyway, these are not the focus of what I wanted to talk about. It's more the Ma'Khia thing.
Yeah. Well, let's actually, because just getting into kind of like, modern police abuses. I've never I've read your books where these subjects are touched upon, but for those that haven't read it, can you give like a bit of a summary of growing up in Queens, right? 60s, 70s, 80s, what that was like, what racism was like. I grew up in New York City in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s. So I've seen different things, right? But I want to compare and contrast. And for people that don't really know what it was like, maybe you could fill in some of those details. And then we could talk about cops and other stuff like that too.
The two things that stick in my mind when you're saying that, well, one, my dad, and walking out of a lot of family gatherings. My dad was, people think most people of German descent have to be right-wing Nazis, but there's a very liberal socialist strain in Germany too. And my dad was of that. My dad was a very open-minded person. He worked with Blacks and Puerto Ricans when he worked at the New York City Health Department, driving a van. I remember driving along with him in the early 1970s during the sickle cell anemia crisis, which, if anyone knows, Black people and Mediterranean people too are more prone to their red blood cell. I believe it's the red blood cells turning sickle-like rather than being circular, which makes it more difficult to pass into smaller veins and arteries in the extremities. And this was a big crisis in the early 70s in New York City, especially. So my dad was very in touch with stuff. And the other thing that came to mind was you. And I remember over the years seeing your sort of panoply of different colored girlfriends and whatnot. And I remember thinking when we first met, I said, damn, I wish I had grown up 20 years later, because if I had tried to bring home any of the girls basically that you were interested in, they would have been raped, I would have been killed, or both of us would have been killed, because I was the closest I could come to was maybe a light-skinned Latina girl if I had the hots for. But anyway, those are the two things. My dad's constant battles with his own family, which were Long Island Republicans, who would probably be considered liberal Republicans if there is such a thing still. But nonetheless, my dad walking out talking about when my family would talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, and then the limited supply of females, which would have enhanced my life had I been born 20 years later.
Yeah. So in your books, you sometimes talk about, I'm not sure if this is a pseudonym or what, you talk about this girl, Simone Francis, right? That you were interested in, but you couldn't date her because she was Black. So like, just to stay on that for a second. So your experiences then were, interracial dating was very much frowned upon. By the time that I was in high school, there was like nobody cared at all, right? In fact, like even like walking down the street with a Black or whoever, even in a Black neighborhood, like I've never felt any kind of hostility, right? That wasn't really part of my life. And
let me just one thing. When I've been on Facebook and I'm in groups of like Long Island Memories, Queens Memories, Ridgewood, Glendale Memories, which are neighborhoods in Queens, which is part of Long Island. There are people that I know that are some of my Facebook friends, and other people, they'll talk about, oh, I grew up as Beaver Cleaver and this, and everything was wonderful. And I remember just recently, a few weeks ago, I got kicked out of a group because I said, you're living in a fantasy. I said, the 1970s in New York were far more taxi drivers than they were Beaver Cleaver. And, and I know that it's bullshit, because even some of the people who I still am in contact with on Facebook, they'll write things in their posts about things we had in common, where we worked or I knew. And I'm like, I don't understand where these people get it. They'll talk about the 104th precinct and everyone respected the cops. What are you talking about? I remember. I'm old enough to remember when the dirty immigrants weren't Hispanics, but were Slavs who worked in the knitting mills along the Brooklyn-Queens border. And when the cops used to come in, and they would. And I even wrote about, I think in my True Life memoir, about cops who killed a Slavic waiter and accidentally when they were harassing a restaurant, and they covered that up. And this was all from the 104th precinct. And I talked about the 104th precinct, how I was one time this Hispanic woman who was a drug addict was stealing some meat, and two cops finger fucked her in the car while I was driving with them to fill out the report for the company I worked for. This is the kind of over-the-top stuff that cops would get away with, not to mention the harassment of the general harassment of Blacks. When the neighborhood I lived in on 79th Place in Glendale, there used to be factories in this place called Atlas Terminal, which was this mobbed up place. And there would be Black janitors who'd sometimes have to walk just 2 or 3 blocks from the terminal to catch a bus to go to Jamaica. And I remember little old ladies coming or ringing the bell, and you'd open the door. I'm not going to say the N-word. There's an N-word in the neighborhood. Did you see what they're doing? And you'd see these guys, they come out of the little deli that was there, and they'd have a can of beer or a sandwich that they bought, and it's like they're walking through the neighborhood, pass it on, lock your door, and it's like, these are middle-aged guys who are coming off of an 8-hour or 10-hour shift. They got pot bellies. They wanted to get out of there. Or when I went to junior high school 119, there was this kid, his name was Danny Price. That was his real name. He and another Black kid were beaten to a van pulled up. These guys who were 2 or 3 years older who could drive beat the crap out of them with bats and water. I never saw Danny or his friend again. They did survive. This was long before these things even became like the famous incidents in Howard Beach and Bensonhurst in the 80s or stuff. It was just buried on page 47. 2 young children in the Glendale neighborhood were walking to the bus stop and were beaten to death. Boom. 3 sentences, and it was accepted that this was just what they had to deal with, and I I knew the kid who actually did it. He's dead now, and I'm happy because he was a son of a bitch. And I smiled when I saw the Facebook. But of course, these people would say, "Oh, he was a child of God," and what? No, I knew him as a fucking asshole bigot who beat this kid that was my friend in junior high school nearly to death with a bat simply because of the color of his skin. And yet, and my one vengeance against him was when I was working for this mob. I guess you call it this mob place in their warehouse. This guy came to apply for a job, and I told him about this kid who was bragging about this, about beating this black kid nearly to death. These 2 black kids, him and his friends, and the gangsters had some people beat the shit out of him simply because of his being a squealer. And it's interesting because these gangsters who I saw do many things of violence against black people who happened to cross the Brooklyn-Queens border, with their bizarre sense of honor was that this kid was so stupid in talking about what he did in beating the black guy that they beat him just on their own bizarre principle. But anyway, that's getting off topic.
Yeah. I wanted that as an intro because I guess I wasn't totally surprised when I read of your experiences because obviously the further back in history that you go, you're gonna get more and more of this. But just growing up, right, there was just far less racial tension. I think it has to do much more with just old generations dying out, right? There's so many ideas that only occur not because finally the argument is seen for what it is, but because old people die, new people take their place, and stuff that is kind of obvious and doesn't have any disadvantages of just being born into a kind of a wrong perspective. Those get done away with. So even in the 90s and 2000s. If somewhere at school were to make a racial joke, it would very much be frowned upon. Not that I didn't hear them, but generally speaking, it wasn't something that kids found funny or interesting to do. Racial violence was definitely a lot more rare, at least compared to than how you described it. And just like you, I'm often surprised at this kind of very weird golden age thinking. So you got kicked out of that nostalgia group in Queens or whatever. And one thing that I'm kind of struck by when I listen to, I guess you could sort of call him a conservative, that guy, that former basketball player, Kwame Brown, and others, when people talk about the way things were, things used to be better. It's well, the peak of crime in New York City only hit that peak in 1991. Right? You had the 70s, you had the 80s. There's no possible way that what's going on today is in any way comparable to 60s, 70s, and 80s levels of crime, right? So even on that kind of very basic objective metric, right? People always want safe neighborhoods. People want to be away from violence. It's kind of weird to me how these people that could look back on that life and those neighborhoods and not really see the reality for what it was compared to what's going on today.
That's the definition of privilege.
But even with privilege though, wouldn't they have at least seen some of this and by comparison see that it's not going on now?
And they deny it. And like I said, recently on Facebook, a couple of my Facebook friends were talking about the 104th precinct, and it was related to this Ma'Khia Bryant thing. And I was arguing with them about if she was white, she would not be dead. Oh, and the argument is, the cop did a good thing because Ma'Khia was trying to kill a black girl. That's not the point. The point is he would never have brought out his gun if it had been 2 white girls, even if they both had knives. They would have disarmed. And there are videos that show, for example, I've seen videos where some crazed white guy comes out with a knife and the cops back away, and the cops both have their guns. but they don't even draw the guns. They just back away, and the guy will lunge and make. They don't do it. There is this primal thing that white people have when they see a black person, even if it's a fat teenage girl like this 15 or 16-year-old Ma'Khia, who's rolling around like a bowl of jelly in half the 40-second video, rolling around and there's something that I must kill. And I know that the people that I worked with and knew in New York know this, because they knew about, for example, this pedophile who killed shopping bag boys at the store. They knew about, but if you talk about, they don't want to remember it. There is the human tendency to want to forget and make everything seem good, and I understand that. I try to look on the bright side of things. If I look back at some women that I was involved with, and I told you about some crazy broad who's now scamming people with her religious bullshit nonsense. I tried for years to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I have to come to the conclusion that she's now just a scam artist. And in the same way, these people are going to have to come to the conclusion that bigotry exists and racism exists, and it's not black people's fault that you're fearful of them. It's not their fault that you want to that you're so in your little bubble that you want to pretend that everyone was given a fair chance when they weren't. I mean, how I don't understand how anyone could. I mean, you can use the argument against like quotas and say, well, everyone now should be treated fairly, but that doesn't. It's not just one thing. It's redlining. When people are redlined into certain neighborhoods, and I'll bet you, and you would know this, I'll bet you redlining still occurs in most of New York. I'll bet you Glendale, and I even said this to some of these people on some of these groups. I said, how many black people have you ever lived next to or on your block? Because when my mom and I sold our home in New York in 1991, we got death threats saying that they would burn the house down if we sold it to an N-word or a Puerto Rican.
Yeah. One thing I'll say is, I've often said that when it comes to this kind of everyday racism that's kind of like present in the younger generation, a lot of this has to do with the fact that if people grow up in segregated communities, it's actually, and I'm wondering what you think about this, it's actually very natural for white people and even black people to fear each other in some way. Because, I mean, if you think about the ancestral environment, you're never going to find a situation where black people and white people and Asian people would have intermixed, right? And in fact, like any kind of like visible difference between human beings would be taken as evidence of this is someone that is willing to murder me if he gets a chance, right? Because back then it wasn't really like too many physical differences. It was more like, let's say in Africa, that one village over 10, 20, 30 miles away, they have a slightly different kind of linguistic dialect. And because of that, right, this is the thing I need to fear. If they come over to my territory, they could kill me or I could kill them. So I could easily see a situation where that sort of thing psychologically gets extrapolated to, everyday interactions where because of segregation, even if you want to do the right thing, you're still going to be fearful. And this kind of came, kind of like more and more into my, understanding more recently, where I had a friend visit me recently who I went to high school with. So I'm Russian, he's Russian. And I live in a neighborhood that's primarily non-white. It's mostly black and kind of like Indian, immigrant West Indian. And when he just like it's like a 4-minute walk from the train to my house, and he was literally scared walking down the street, and he was telling me like, I'm kind of scared walking down the street. Like, is it safe for me to take this train? Safe for me to take that train? And it's like, he went to a high school with me that was like primarily non-white, and even that was not sufficient to sort of like break his experience in so that he doesn't like naturally flinch right? When it comes to like non-whites around him. And most people behave that way, right? You ask this question in the book, why do white people fear so much? And I think a lot of this answer has to do with the fact that if you grow up in an environment where you're literally not around people that don't look like you, just biologically speaking, you almost have no choice, right? Even if you do try to be a good person, you're still going to be fearful. You're still going to have these silly questions about like, is it safe to walk down the street? It's just this kind of mainstay.
But the problem in America, there is so many different variations. Let me give you two other examples. I've lived in 3 states, New York, Minnesota, and Texas. In the 1990s, when I was living in Minnesota, literally, my natural family, my biological family, I'm adopted, they lived out in Minnesota, and they were still using, and a lot of Minnesotans were talking about mulattoes, quadroons, and even Bruce Ario, the poet, will still sometimes refer to negresses. Now, I'm not one of these people, we've talked about a lot of the silliness, a lot of the gender stuff and all these ridiculous, 182 genders or whatnot. So there is certainly the thing that people can change, society changes things. You go from Negro to Black to African-American or whatnot. So things do change. But this was in the 1990s and they were still using 1950s language. And here in Texas, I'll just give you 2 examples of how it's different from New York. I live in a very multicultural neighborhood. I've never had a Black person on either side of our home, but I've had Hispanics, Muslims, and one guy who I think was a Hindu. And there's probably about 10% Black people in the little subdivision I live in. So in some ways, people would say, that's very much like the 1970s kind of Jim films that you were in the future, people of all colors and races will live together in harmony. In one way, that's true. But in Texas, they will look at that kind of thing. And Texas, with the winter storm, which we talked of, it means everyone, that everyone, yes, and well, now you're all equal, but you're just like N-words or just like Mexicans. And the best example of this, of how backwards Texas is about 12, 15 years ago, that big PDF of my poems that I've sent you and other people, I had made copies of my poems physically, and I found it cheaper to buy a little copier than to make copies of 8,000 pages of whatever that I wanted to copy. It was cheaper to actually just buy the paper and the machine than to go to Office Max or something and copy them there. So I bought this copier. About a month into doing all this copying, it broke down, so I had to bring it to the place where the warranty was. And it was an elderly Black guy who was the repairman. This would have been 10, 15, I was 41. This guy's probably pushing retirement, so he's probably 20 plus years older than me. When I went back 2 or 3 days later when it was fixed, I paid, I don't think I had to pay for anything because it was on warranty. And he said, yeah, do this and this, it worked, this is what happened, sorry about it. And, and he was very nice. And, I extended my hand to shake his hand. And the guy looked at me and he's like, it took him about 5 or 10 seconds before he sort of like, to shake my hand. This was 2007, 2008. This is in a suburb of Austin, Texas, the most liberal part of Texas, other than maybe El Paso. And yet here still was a guy living in the 1940s. A white man is just extending his hand in just common courtesy for me doing a good job. And I could see he was, and then when I shook it, he beamed. It was like, it was like he had a weekend away with Halle Berry.
Do you still notice that in general? Because I've been trying to be kind of like very, very attentive in my interactions with like older Black people, because I noticed the same kind of strain where there's this kind of very weird, deferential aspect to their behavior, especially if like, I don't know, like something breaks down and, a tech comes out and they're working on something on your house or whatever. Like anybody, like Black people that are like above 50, 60, there's still very often this kind of weird differential quality,
Yes.
right? And this is like even despite the fact that I would be significantly younger than them, and I've been more and more attentive to that. Like, do you still notice that?
Yes, and here in Texas, once you get away from the population centers, after we do this, I'm taking Jessica out to a winery about 40 miles out west. Once you start getting the guys who wear the 10-gallon cowboy hats and you get into the little towns in Texas, you will see rural Black Texans. They still shuffle along as if they're step and fetch it, and they'll still cower at a restaurant. And if they come into a restaurant, the white people who own it will be with the 10-gallon hat. I talked about this when we talked about my book, Working with Teachers, how I was Dan, and yet they were Mr. or Mrs. Teacher. And you will still, the Black person will come, well, hello, Mr. Halep or whoever owns the restaurant. And, the white guy, well, how are you doing, Benji? And he'll act in this very paternalistic child. The Black guy might be 25 years older than him, but he's still treated as a child. And the Black people accept it. And the white people say, well, we, sir, Nigraz. Can I say that? They won't.
So just to fill people in, it's not that I've gone soft on you guys. I've used the actual N word on these videos before, but once this gets uploaded to these other platforms, I don't want them to take down the whole thing.
Yeah. So they instead of saying the N word, they will say Nigra. They'll use that as that. See, I didn't call him the N word. I'm progressive. Now these people, the farther out, it's sort of like every 10 miles out from a metro center, you go back a decade. So once you get to about 50 miles out, you're back in Jim Crow era.
Yeah. I mean, like in general, I think one thing that people underestimate is just how like if you go through life with certain qualities, right? Whether it's like you're white or you're Black or you're ugly, you're attractive, your life is incredibly different. I don't really know what it's like to be a Black person, right? But I also know that, as a white person walking down the street, I have never, even once been harassed by cops, right? Very different from your experience, which is another thing that we're going to talk about. You grew up constantly being harassed by cops, but now I notice that that at this point kind of fractures mostly along racial lines at this point, right? Cops are no longer kind of, they used to be a little bit more equal opportunity offenders, but now it's very kind of like race-based.
Let me just, before we go on to something else, in the book, I talk about this manager that I called Jim Harry. That wasn't his real name. He's dead now. His real name was Gene Barry. And I mentioned this on Facebook with some friends when they were talking about it. Everyone loved him, but he would call himself a white N-word. He would say, this company treats me like a white N-word. And you couldn't get away with that nowadays. But he himself, I'm sure he wouldn't have been happy if his son had come home with a Black girlfriend or something. But he was one of these people who, even though he had the trappings of being a bigot, it was a lot of people are like him. The Black people loved him when he worked with, because he did the shit work, the grunt work. The fact that this is why he would call himself. That was his way to say, I'm not a bigot. I am a white N-word. I'm just like you. But it's that awkward kind of way of trying to empathize with people. But the Black people loved him because in those days, 30 some years ago, going close to 40 years ago, that was being progressive. That was, and he didn't show any bigotry in how he treated people. He called you a short cock if you didn't like, whether you're a Black kid or a white kid, and that's why he was loved and respected, and everyone wanted to work for this fellow Gene, but he couldn't get away with that. And so this is why I say there are different shades of bigotry and racism. Someone like this Gene Barry was probably just ignorant. It's just ignorant. I always look at it as a kind of being semi-retarded, although can you say retarded? That I look at racism as sort of a mental retardation that people have, or bigotry in general. And so there's a difference between that, and there's a difference between the Derek Chauvins of the world and whatnot. And you have to be able to see these filigrees of difference because they do exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, would you agree with the idea that over time, police brutality has gotten better, right? Meaning there's less of it in general?
Probably, but it was, like I said, it's hard to say because you'd have to sift through old newspapers and, page 47, three Negro youths were accosted by, a resisted arrest, and two of them were shot dead, 1957. Well, that would probably be a big incident today that, two people just shot dead. But, George Floyd would have been, page 67 of the local news, it wouldn't have mattered. So it probably is. But then again, I think there probably has been a slight resurgence, say, from the late 90s or the turn of the century. I think there has been a resurgence. I don't think it's been fueled by the Trumps, people like Trump, or Fox News or whatnot. I think they have ridden that because, it's again, if you don't do what we say, if you don't vote like we want to vote, we can take what little shit you have. We can take away your cell phones. We can take away your cable subscription. We can take away Netflix. We can take away your electric blanket because we'll make you a white N-word.
Yeah, well, that's a good observation about there being a resurgence in police brutality since the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, because, well, first of all, up until a couple of years ago, the standard wisdom was that, hey, police brutality has been more or less getting better in an unbroken line. But last year, after George Floyd, there was this kind of just a huge study that came out, the biggest study of its kind, that actually showed that although police brutality in general has been getting better when you do a long enough time span, meaning like a century, the late 90s started seeing that uptick again. It was due to militarization. It was due to, police unions negotiating the ability to use, a lethal force in ways that are unacceptable.
People like David Koresh becoming heroes. People like David Koresh, here in Waco, the siege in Waco. This is how you get the whole idea of, deep government, or what was it called, deep state, or whatever the term is. The end result is January 6th. But something like when this Ma'Khia girl was stabbed, people are saying, well, there have been X amount of incidents, and where there were more incidents with black people or with white people having guns pulled on them. Yes, but not percentage wise, and we don't know about all the incidents where there were people, white people resisting. And usually what happens too, when a white person gets shot or something, they're actually resisting. This isn't like, a lot of the times when a black person, a kid is walking away, or just, stop. The black kid's walking away, boom, 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 3 shots to the back or something. He's not pulling out a gun. He's walking away, disengaging. And I think part of the thing, if you want to talk about bigotry, like especially in this Ma'Khia Bryant case, is that they don't care to give enough training for the people who are going to be serving in those neighborhoods. If you are, and I think the cop was from I think the city was a fairly affluent city next door or something. Maybe the cop was even from like a nearby city or whatnot. But if you don't give the training, if you don't teach people how to interact with other people, there are going to be problems. This is one of the reasons why, since we still have enclaves racially and ethnically, you need to have the people in charge look like the people who are there. That's not to say you can't have a white cop in a black neighborhood, but if you have 10 cops that patrol a certain area that's a mostly black neighborhood, you should have maybe no more than 1 or 2 white cops, a couple of Hispanics, and mostly black people who can interact with that. So that one of the reasons a lot of these black kids will walk away and just be defiant from a cop, and the cop then guns them down, is because they know pretty much that they're fucked the minute they're stopped. And no matter what they do, something is going to happen. people famously, now black people talk about the talk that every father and mother give, especially their black sons, about when they're stopped or pulled over in a car, or any cop stops them. White people don't have to deal with that. Yes, to a certain degree, I know what it's like, but I'm an extreme outlier in that sense.
Yeah, just a couple of notes there. In terms of like, even if we have a decline over a century in things like police brutality, one thing that has always struck me is just how, there's so much shit that non-whites have to deal with from the cops that will literally never make it into any kind of statistics. When I was growing up, it played out in terms of constant getting stopped, your stuff taken away, maybe, a cop might slap you or something. But generally speaking, like non-whites would experience this, like, my friends, like once a week, they would have some kind of story for me, right, about these kinds of incidents. And it's not like you got shot by a cop. It's not like you got killed by a cop. So these are not things that ever make it into statistics. And I just wonder, like, with all the stuff that's being said about, like, well, policing is getting better in this fashion or that fashion, I wonder what would happen if we could, in some magical fashion, be able to keep, all these incidents that do exist, somewhere on video, right? Or having them, written up in some way so that you could actually get a sense of what it's like, to be a non-white walking down a neighborhood, having a different set of experiences that way.
I mentioned the Hispanic girl that was fingered by two cops who arrested her for shoplifting. And I'm sure that this drug addict, which she was, probably had no clue that she was molested.
Yeah.
I in my book and my memoirs, I talk about me and this kid. I think I called him Georgie in the book. How one time we were stopped and the cop made us drop our drawers, and he took his baton and he diddled our balls just to sort of sexually humiliate us. Mm-hmm. It didn't bother me that much, but I know the other kid was upset, right? And he was Irish. I Scandinavian, Northern European. And if they're doing that to young white kids who are poor, much worse was going on in Bushwick and black neighborhoods in that time. So it's always been that way. And, people, the good old days of what, Serpico? The Serpico era.
You mentioned like black and just generally non-white representation in the police force. I think obviously, this would be a good idea if you could have people that look like, the people that they're policing. On the other hand, I wonder to what degree this actually helps. Like, not that it doesn't help at all, but I think back to people that I knew, like this other guy from high school. So like I knew him in high school. He's a Jamaican, and he left high school and then he entered the police force. And the last time that I talked to him, it was like years ago. This was during the choking out of Eric Garner in Staten Island. And this guy was just like, straight up justifying this, right? He was saying, it's fine that this happened. He shouldn't have resisted arrest, blah, 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 right? It's a very typical kind of, white speak when it comes to these kind of, police brutality justifications. And, but this guy's Jamaican and he's seeing another black guy getting choked out. And I'm sure growing up, he's seen all sorts of negative incidents.
There are black on black bigotry. You talk about
but even specifically with cops, like even beyond the fact that there's a lot of like self-hatred and something like the black community. I mean, there has to be, given they exist in the margins of society, right? You would expect that, but also if you join a police force, like it's perfectly fine if like you could have two tribes, right? One of my tribes is black people. Maybe I would treat them preferentially in some way. But the other tribe now, if you join the police forces, I'm also now a cop. And black people aren't paying your salary. Black people aren't giving you the benefits. Black people aren't going to be the ones that will be determining whether or not you get like some bad patrol, right? Or whether or not, someone is going to sort of have your back, right? In some sort of gunfight. So even if you're, normally and nominally kind of, sympathetic as a black person to the black people you're policing, on some level, it's very predictable that since your biggest tribe now, the most consequential tribe for your life is the fact that you're in the police force, that is going to take precedence over anything else, including your skin color.
Yeah. It just brought to mind three times in my life I've been in crowds where the N-word and bigoted stuff were against blacks was spoken the most. One, I talked about before on my show, I don't know if I on your show, how a friend of mine who was in the Cub Scout, his father turned out to be the Long Island Ku Klux Klan leader, and I accidentally went to a Ku Klux Klan meeting with them, thinking I was going to play volleyball and picnic, and I first thought they were gay guys in dresses, and then they in white dress, and then they put on the hood, and I'm like, holy fucking shit! But so that was it. But the two other times when the N-word flew as much, or if not more, involved all black people. One, July 4th, 1998 in Minnesota, when I saved this white woman who was trying to break up a gang fight between Ethiopians and Eritreans. And then, you N-word, they would come, you and these, and I said to this woman, you can't stop these people. They've been killing each other and hating each other before there were white people. And the third time that had happened was when I worked volunteered at my mother's senior citizen center, and I was driving people to voting, and another senior center asked me to help drive people over there. And it was mostly black people. About a third of the black people in this black senior center back in the 1980s were Africans, not African Americans, but Africans. Africans who come to the U.S. talk about the N-word African Americans like you wouldn't believe. They think black Americans are the lowest scum of the earth, and that they deserve what white people did to them.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because I mean, like, this is considered not politically correct. People always want to sort of hide the fact that there's tons of racial tension between Hispanic communities and blacks, and also blacks coming out of and Jews and blacks. I mean, when it comes to, for example, hate crimes in New York City, all the attention recently was on the spike in hate crimes against Asians. But even if you sort of control for population, the crimes against Jews in New York City, they're 4 times as high, even with the spikes against Asians. And that mostly has to do with the fact that you have Jews living in New York City, in neighborhoods that are very close to black neighborhoods or within black neighborhoods. So it makes sense that with enough sort of interactions, right? I think it was something like 120 incidents last year. You would have, 120 incidents potentially of, it's going to be primarily black people, right? Robbing people that are, close to them. There's nothing special about it, but bringing up these numbers makes it seem, kind of nefarious. But, the second that you start thinking these kinds of like very ordinary human interactions are nefarious, that's when you start engaging in the sort of like black noble savage myth. I mean, they do it even with most of the attacks against Asians in New York City recently have come from black people, and it's very predictable as to why that would be the case. These are like half of these people are homeless, and they have, mental issues. They've been incarcerated before. It's very predictable that if you have human beings in the margins of society, you introduce some sort of volatile factor, some new volatile factor in their life, such as coronavirus. Of course, they're going to have bigoted views. Of course, they're going to lash out in volatile fashion, because this is what life is like, right?
Let me give you a corollary. Here in Texas, a lot of Vietnamese came after the Vietnamese War, and they became fishermen along the Gulf Coast. And what's happened, and I've seen this and heard this from people who lived along the Gulf Coast, and I've also looked up online and stuff. A lot of the people, Mexicans there are not many blacks along the Gulf Coast. I guess there probably are here or there, but in a lot of towns, Mexicans were at the bottom of the economic barrel. And when the Vietnamese came in, they were more successful than the Mexicans. And there became tensions between Mexicans and the Vietnamese in these small outlets, not between Mexicans and the white people, not between Vietnamese and the white people, but from the newcomers, the Vietnamese, who somehow to the Mexicans were given favor, because that's why they were economically doing better. In a very similar way, I'm sure part of the reasons that Asians are now being attacked in New York probably has to do with a lot of the black people, like you said, if they're mentally ill, probably like, how are these people, how did they get their business? How did they open a restaurant? They must be kissing the man's ass kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like resentments like that. You mentioned the Africans that are kind of, very racist against native-born Black Americans, and this just strikes me as Africans coming over and aping, the white immigrant experience, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember when I spent like a month in Greece like 10 years ago, we had there were like Africans, like there were illegal African immigrants there on the street, sort of selling, bootleg goods, that sort of thing. And I'm sure, though, that if they were polled, if they were asked, they might not have the same kind of negative viewpoints against native born Black Americans, because unlike the Black Africans that are coming over here, right? Africans that can make it into America legally, they probably are hyper educated. They probably have some wealth to fall back on, in Africa, upper class in Africa, which is why they're able to make it to the United States. And you see the same kind of mentality from immigrants in general. You have tons of, Hispanics coming over here. If they are able to do so legally, they look down upon people that cross the border illegally, right?
Well, and let me just give you another. Right next door in Turkey, basketball is big. LeBron James, Black players, they're American NBA players are gods when they go to Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you had, pick out Chris Paul, LeBron James, and whoever else, big stars go over there, they are worshipped like God. In the same way, I'm sure, because now Giannis Antetokounmpo, the Greek freak, the basketball player for the Milwaukee Bucks, they just won the NBA title. He's a Black kid who I guess he's half Black, who grew up in Greece. So they call him the Greek freak. He's a god in Greece. And these people in foreign countries only know Black culture through rap, through the NBA, pro sports. So all they know are, Black people in America are worshipped and they're rich. Mm-hmm. The Black Africans who come here, though, they will see the actual state that most Black Americans live in, and they're not LeBron James. They're not mm-hmm. living the high life like all these rap stars. So that's going to account for the difference too.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of this I feel like goes down to, like, if you think about it, like emotionally and materially, the typical kind of like conservative bootstraps mentality. Why don't they just work hard? Or look at me, I came from Africa and I made it to the United States. And they completely ignore, the bottleneck effects of immigration. They ignore the fact that, they're starting out in a very different situation than a native born Black American. And that's true of like immigrants of any kind of stripe, right? That look down on people of their own kind of ethnicity that, like one of the worst things you could be in some ways is to be like a native born American compared to much of the rest of the Western world. Whereas one of the best things that you could be is an immigrant that's able and lucky enough to make it into America legally, right? Because those two things imply bottlenecks in completely, different directions. And I just see tons of this like conservative mentality propping up, and it's probably going to get more and more popular, honestly, even especially within the Black community, right? More and more people are going to start disconnecting from the Democratic Party, and like you'll eventually get some sort of like Black entrepreneur class that's going to prey on Black people by sort of, feeding them this poison about personal responsibility and other things that, on some level, I get why people have these mentalities, but another level that has nothing to do with everyday material reality.
Yeah, and there are always going to be Clarence Thomases and Thomas Sowells. A lot of the people fall into it without necessarily embracing that mentality. They just fall back into the easy explanations. Well, they're not trying. I see it all over the online when I argue that immigrants that come to this country will say the same thing about Blacks. And we can't even talk about Native Americans, because most immigrants probably don't even know that Native Americans exist anymore, because they're the one group that maybe arguably has it worse off than Black Americans in this country, but their suffering is totally, they are the crazy ant in the attic of America, that no one talks about.
Yeah, let's just touch on like three things before we get to the Ma'Khia Bryant video. So So first you mentioned, okay, so like when it comes to like stuff like, Black conservatism, I'm not sure if it was in this book, because the second time reading it, I didn't notice this passage again, but you mentioned, maybe it was in another book, something along the lines of, white America has really fucked over Black America, historically and now, but at some point, you're waiting to see the Black community sort of take responsibility for itself. I'm not sure. Did you say that, or
It doesn't
like?
sound like me. I mean,
Yeah, it doesn't. But it was like a stray offhand sentence somewhere. I think it was in one of your books, but
I mean, I may have been quoting someone. I don't
yeah.
know.
Well, I mean, I just want to talk about this idea of like personal responsibility, because there's a sort of naive way to.
And who is the person most pushing this stuff? Bill Cosby.
Yeah,
Back
yeah,
15,
that's always
Bill Cosby.
anybody that's so moralizing, you should never trust them.
Yeah.
Anybody that over moralizes this much, right? Like they're always the ones, like they have to be project, and that's what I've noticed, like over time, right? Like people that are so adamant about these kinds of point of views, they're usually the ones that are trying to escape something that they're doing wrong. Like I'm sure Bill Cosby, even if he's sociopathic on some level, there must be some little bit of guilt or something that goes on, right? Where you need to engage in these kinds of weird justifications. And so anyway, like there's like a naive way of viewing personal responsibility where policy doesn't matter. Like Ben Shapiro classically says, oh, you want to not be poor in America, here's what you do. You have to A, graduate high school, B, not have kids out of wedlock, and C, if you can, get a trade or going to college or something. And it's like, well, that's very easy to say, but the problem is when you're talking about not one person, but millions and millions of people in various kinds of circumstances, we know that if you just change the variables a little bit, you will have either more or less out of wedlock births. You're either going to have more or less homicide, right? So the moral imperative in that situation for anybody that has any kind of power is you have to change the variables up, because if you do that, you change those outcomes. On the other hand, people completely might push back against this idea of free will. And you and I disagree with this. It's not that I even technically even believe in, a libertarian style free will. But the point is, if you don't at least give lip service to personal change, if you don't at least talk about free will, in some nominal way, people do start getting this like feeling of like, I can't escape circumstances. Nothing even matters. There's a big difference between, like let's say a preacher somewhere that tries to like cultivate relationships with, some like kids that might easily, go in the wrong direction. And that could be the difference between a kid, having a good life with good outcomes versus someone going into, a criminal underworld. That part is true, but that is also part of your everyday material reality. And yet that can never, ever substitute for real, robust top-down policies, which in ways that are kind of, able to scale up again and again, they're able to change those variables, and therefore they're able to change the probability space, which means they're changing those outcomes.
Well, a society that's dependent upon any kind of charity doing things that government should do is a failed society, because the very existence of government is to provide for things that people can't provide for themselves. William Glass, a poet that we both know who's on the E-list, he's doing that very thing you're talking about, working with minorities I think it's in Tennessee. He's a preacher, and I'm not religious and whatnot, but I give him all the props to do that. But he shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the point. He should not have to do that. Well, I don't want to get off on a digression about missionary kind of things, but I mean, he's a good guy doing what he's doing, and he's one of the finest people that I know, and I give him all the props for that. So.
Yeah. And like, I mean, there's always a place, like, I wouldn't say that all those examples are examples of a failed society, because I mean, there's always going to be a place for a preacher type, or even like a strong parent or a good teacher, right? That could really sway a kid's outcomes. You're always going to have those niches, but that shouldn't be, the thing that society depends upon, right? To make these kinds of changes, which is why, like, I remember, like, when I did that Ben Shapiro essay, a bunch of people were telling me like, oh, like you should read Thomas Sowell and like respond to this or that. argument. And I just like pulled up some like articles from him, and it's like, these are arguments that are so childish. Like, I can imagine a 15-year-old that just discovered like, libertarianism sort of be like, oh yeah, this is like so brilliant. But if you're older than 15, you know that you can't move any kind of society based on moralizing from a mountaintop. One of the things that gets to me, like when people talk about like sexual dynamics, for example, in the Black community, they say things like, why are, Black women having, kids out of wedlock? I think there's like a lot of issues you could take
because Black people can't have sex to have fun. Why don't we make condoms available for all? It's a minor cost of society. I mean, if the only thing you have in your life is cable TV and fucking, that's what people are going to do to have fun. And why, look at all these celebrities, look at all these rich people that have kids out of wedlock. Why are they never talked about? I just mentioned Elon Musk. He's having a child with his girlfriend. Why is he having a child out of it? Oh, because he's the third richest guy in the world. So It's okay that he has another kid brought into this world and whatnot. Well, he needs less of an ego stroke than a Black guy who's a plumber who's fearful of being laid off during COVID.
Yeah, and also, I mean, so like even those statistics, right, about like sex in the Black communities there's lots of stuff that you could take issue with. But even if you accept all those arguments that the picture is as it's being painted, typically, just anthropologically speaking, like just think about the fact that in the Black community right now, you have a gender imbalance, right? You have more Black females than you have Black males. The reason for that is it's very, easy to understand. You have Black males who are being incarcerated, so that causes the imbalance. Males in general, when it comes to any kind of a society that has violence, they're going to be the first ones to get slaughtered, right? Whether it's like you're a drug dealer or whether you're an innocent person that's just getting, shot by, someone that's preying on you in the Black community. If you have this kind of imbalance, right? Any place that you could look at historically with these sorts of imbalances, you will always have sexual dynamics default preferentially to male sexual desire, right? Why are women more willing to perhaps have unprotected sex? Well, if you have a male that's calling the shots in that situation, right? The so-called, there are no Black eligible bachelors. Women are going to naturally lower their standards, lower their normal behavioral standards, and you're going to have these kinds of outcomes. But you don't, nowhere in history has that ever been changed by moralizing from a mountaintop. What you did historically was you changed these imbalances, you made things normal, you gave people jobs to the point that they don't even want to have kids, right? Because their careers become their children in a way. And that solves that problem, of its own accord. Why is it that people in Europe are complaining about we're not fertile enough, we're not having enough kids? It's because, people, if they have careers, they don't want to have kids, right? It's a very different situation in something like, the projects or something.
It's funny you mentioned that, because just yesterday on a social media site, I saw this post about interracial dating. This Black woman was going on saying, I'll never date Black men again. I've had 7 boyfriends. My current boyfriend is a white guy. He's the only guy who's never beaten me. He's the only guy who treats me like a lady. And there were, 1,171 replies or something, and probably 3/4 of them that will claim to be Black women were saying the same thing. And it's like, I'm not against interracial dating, but I mean, don't they realize what? Of course, they're not going to understand these socioeconomic things that go behind this thing and why Black men are more frustrated. The only place that they can take out their aggression without being shot dead is maybe against the Black woman that they are in a relationship with. That's not to justify it. That's not to justify Black women getting beaten. But I don't think it serves any good to make it seem as though and this is what these women are doing, making it seem as if there's something fundamentally wrong with Black men, because all of these things we're talking about, all of these things have to do with socioeconomic policies that are put upon the Black community because of the racism from above. Because if you do go to Madagascar, or if you do go to Uruguay, or if you do go to Indonesia, or if you do go to a province in Siberia, what you will find is the highest rates of alcoholism, the highest rates of drug abuse, the highest rates of crime the highest rates of poverty are always on whatever group is on the bottom. And usually those groups on the bottom are on the bottom, not because of anything but their ethnic status. So when we talk about Black racism here, we could talk just as easily about Black racism in New Zealand against the Maoris, or in Indonesia, whatever group that is, I don't even know. We could talk about the Hmong population, which doesn't have a country in Southeast Asia. You may be familiar with the Hmongs. They are sort of like the.
Is that what's going on like around Burma or what?
Well, there are Hmong across the whole Indochina.
Yeah.
They're sort of what the Kurds are to the Middle East, the Hmong are to Southeast Asia. But in Vietnam, Hmong crime, from what I've read, they are the minority group that no one wants. They are the stepchildren that all the countries, Cambodia, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, they just want to shuffle them off. And of course, they're, if you are a Hmong N-word, you're going to have similar statistics and crime, and you're going to have the same slurs against them and the same biases against them as we have here. So it's not surprising that when you look at like Asians are supposed to be the model minority, right? But that's only because people try to ignore, for example, Hmong and Cambodians and Laotians in the United States. Like if you look at these communities, they have rates of crime and homicide and everything else as bad as the worst Black neighborhoods. And again, just a few weeks ago, I was arguing with this Asian woman who said that she came. America is the only place where you can succeed, and you have to see. She was I think Vietnamese, or maybe she was Korean or something. And I'm like, what? Don't you see what you're doing? I'm like, okay. And I used the very argument you did about the model minority and whatnot. Most fucking people who are East Asian, what we would say Chinese looking with epicanthic folds, they're not in Silicon Valley. They're not all geniuses. They're not all math whizzes. I mean, most of them are running delicatessens. Most of them are doing takeout food or whatnot. And yes, they can send maybe their kids or their grandkids to college who become math whizzes. And they have that cultural, we got to help each other kind of thing. But this idea of playing up the model minority only puts on expectations that when you look back then at the people that are running the delis, that causes friction within your own group. But again, why can I see that? Well, because I've seen people do this time and time again in all groups, religious, ethnic, or whatnot, and people never learn.
And sticking to Asians just for a second here, another critical piece to all this that people ignore is, well, I specifically, said that it's the Hmong and the Laotians and the Cambodians, right, and the Vietnamese that have these very high rates of crime in the United States. The reason for that is these are the groups that are the refugee groups coming from other countries, right? They become essentially no different and indistinguishable from native-born Americans in the sense that if you're an immigrant, right, even if you run a Chinese deli, well, guess what? To make it to America legally and then run a Chinese deli, you're probably doing better than the average Chinese person in China, right? Yeah. So you come with better education. You come, perhaps naturally have greater talents, a greater drive, just genetically speaking, right? Compared to everyone else around you that is not unable to do that. But if you're a Vietnamese or you're a Hmong, you're a Laotian, you're forced over here, ironically, by America's bombing campaigns, right? And by the genocide of your native leaders. And there's no way to create that bottleneck, right? Everybody comes over here. Everybody that is desperate and sick and, has seen such, crazy shit. You're now part of that population, right? You don't get to selectively enforce something like a legal immigration status, right? Refugees are essentially the you don't even want to call them the equivalent of illegal migrants, because even when it comes to people that cross the border illegally, they clearly have gumption, right? They have a set of desires they want to act upon. Whereas if you're a refugee, you're leaving because literally the alternative is death, right? Yeah. You don't have a choice there.
Yeah, and this isn't saying, oh, America is so great. It's like America is better than where I'm from. And yes, you could, for every great immigrant success story they can hear, you don't hear about the 999 stories that fail. And it's the same thing in capitalism, in general. You never hear about the failures. You never hear about the companies that squeeze out competitors that have a better product. But again, that's a bigger issue than just this.
Just two more topics before the video. I want to talk about the concept of the wigger. I think we could say that, right? Because it's directed at white people. But then even before that, so you have this quote in the book about Bushwick. Whites were not targeted for their race specifically, meaning if you're going to like walk around as a white person in some of these neighborhoods. And I've also noticed that myself. Like I was in lots of different Black neighborhoods when I was growing up, and I can count maybe on one hand the number of times that I experienced any kind of genuine racial tension directed at me from Black people, and being like the only white person in some area. This was the case whether or not I was like walking by myself, like through a Black neighborhood, or I could have been walking with like a Black girl through a Black neighborhood. I rarely experienced any kind of tension or hostility, and this honestly has always just like really surprised me, because you would sort of expect that people that are kind of like pushed to the margins, you would expect more resentment, you would expect more anger, you would expect more hostility. I think, in fact, in your book, you have a quote something like, it's kind of amazing that we don't have a violent political movement taking root in the Black community like every 5 years, right? Because, it's in some senses like that anger has been domesticated. And I'm just wondering, like, why do you think that is? Why aren't we getting the expected level of like resentment that's like very visible compared to like maybe other situations?
Well, just to make a point, that the last movement like that was really the Black Panthers. I wouldn't count the Black Muslims because that they're on a different level. That a lot of Black Muslims share a lot of beliefs about Black Americans that are similar to the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
But if you, I mean, with Black Panthers or whatnot, you're going to get government involvement. You're going to get the fraction. You're going to get the demonization of the Huey Newtons and people like that. With people nowadays probably don't even know who Huey Newton was, but and so you're just gonna bring a lot of shit upon yourself, and you're gonna get idiots that will defend the January 6th assholes, who actually stormed the Capitol, and yet if you get Black people, you get 10 Black people together, it's a riot, and you'll get 100 cops in riot gear. As far as just walking through a Black neighborhood, I think it's just the way you physically act. Most people have a good body sense. When I walk through a neighborhood, yes, if I see a group of 6 or 7 young teenage males like who come into my store, for example, and these could be all white kids, they're mostly white kids, I get, oh boy, something's going to happen. They're acting like assholes. So I'm prepared for that. But if you're going into a neighborhood and you're like, even if you're holding the hand of a Black girl or a Hispanic girl, and you're like, they're going to get me. They're going to get, you're just saying, it's, I reminds me of that old Nirvana song, "Rape Me."
Yeah.
It's you're just looking. It's like they'll be like, boy, what the fuck are you doing? What the fuck? You think I'm going to do something? You'll bring that kind of. But if you're just walking with your girl and it's normal as day, generally speaking, people are going to be like, who gives a fuck? Like, it goes back to what I said about all the Black people I've ever worked with have felt very comfortable about me because if I got to fart, I'm going to fart. I'm not going to say, oh, it's a Black person here. I can't scratch my ass or fart if I need to. I don't want to offend them. That fart was not meant against you, Wilbur.
But I mean, even so, like with some of the kind of like more, I guess, like fearful whites that I've known, like just thinking back to high school, I remember like one incident where like some white kid was being bullied by a Black kid, but it didn't even seem like there was like necessarily racial dynamics there. it just feels like I should have seen more of these kinds of incidents that were race-based, directed against white people, simply and purely on account of some level of like racial resentment. And I just don't see that, right? It's just always surprised me, like even on a purely, interpersonal level. And I don't know.
It's building up. It's building up a tolerance. Black people are a lot more tolerant of bullshit, generally speaking, because they have to deal with more. If, like I said, you got white people who think they're, I have a right to spread a disease because I'm uncomfortable wearing masks. I see these idiots. They say, my child, this white people, my child, feels very uncomfortable wearing a mask. What about her mental health? You fucking cocksucking son of a bitch. Fuck your kid's mental health bullshit. You could be spreading the Delta variant or whatnot simply because you're thinking, oh, in 15 years, my child's going to have a complex. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out. Black people, Mom, I have to pick up some bread at the store. Make sure you keep your head and eyes low and don't get any white person angry at you, because if a cop comes along, they'll believe the white person. It's a quantum different level of bullshit that people have to deal with. And the old saying, like you had mentioned, is that the restraint that Black people have shown in not just pulling multiple insurrections and killing the rich white people in their sleep is amazing. I mean, there should have been a Black Robespierre long ago.
One of the things about masks and vaccinations, I haven't noticed, at least in my neighborhood and elsewhere, like people have been very compliant, right, with masks. My zip code got hit particularly hard with coronavirus, and just during the peak of it, I never saw anybody, Black or white or whatever, walking around without a mask here. But one thing that you start noticing with the vaccination rates is non-whites are definitely a lot more skeptical about getting the vaccine. And there's this kind of weird dynamic happening where you have like white liberals that want to blame the lack of vaccination rates on Trump voters, right? They think that this is the reason why it's happening. Whereas the reality is, I mean, like if you're non-white in America, you are going to be kind of skeptical of anybody, like any kind of government decree or suggestion that you have to go and you have to get this kind of shot because of this thing happening. You're going to probably be kind of skeptical about that. But a lot of white people are very uncomfortable, especially talking about this on social media, because it sounds like you're blaming Black people for the spread of the virus. And I mean, like on some level, like to the extent that you're not getting vaccinated, this is true. But by not talking about it, you're also not really getting to discuss the actual cause, which is, why should Black people like trust you when you tell them, take this, this is safe, this is good for you, given the history of injections that Black people have to deal with in this country?
Yeah, and the forced sterilization.
Yeah.
I mean, Black people, even when they were forced sterilizing a white mental incompetence, it was still probably 2 or 3 times as many Black people who were sterilized than the white people. Regarding the wigger thing, that's one of the things where even in 15 years, I think the book has been dated. I don't think wigger is a term that's even used nowadays, is it?
Yeah, it's not. It's not. And if it is, people don't necessarily look down
I don't
on
know.
it.
I don't know if it's even worth talking about Eminem or whatnot, because he's.
Well, I mean, it's just a little bit more on kind of like Black-white racial dynamics. There's definitely a category of person, right? The way that you characterize like the wigger in your book is, it's a white guy that has sort of failed in some way in the white world. And so he takes on the trappings of Black culture in the most superficial sense, because he believes that, subconsciously or whatever, he believes that it's easier to succeed, right, in the Black world in the terms of Black people. And whether or not he realizes it, right, this is obviously, a kind of condescension, right, towards the Black world, right, because if you are only in there simply because you have failed elsewhere, right, that should kind of like tell you everything. And basically, I guess the only thing I wanted to say is I definitely see like this kind of person, right, at present and historically, but another reason why you get white people in Black culture in the way that you do is like I forget who it was, but maybe it was one of the Black Panthers. I was reading some essays. It basically said something like, lots of white kids are growing up seeing that white culture is not really offering that much to them, right? Or perhaps it's a point of view that they no longer accept because they're part of a new generation, and they're seeing something else within Black culture. Now, I don't know exactly, like, well, I could take a guess at what those things were in the 60s and 70s when this kind of stuff was being written. But when I was growing up, I really kind of like fell into Black culture simply because, well, first of all, on the one hand, in terms of like white pop culture, the stuff that was being offered was like, it was like bad movies, right? It was video games. It was bad music. It was, like stuff you would find in Oprah's book club. Whereas in the Black world, you had stuff that was, just more interesting. And there was especially this emphasis in the arts that there is a good and bad that you could adjudicate. And there is something called a talent and a lack of talent. And not only do those things exist, Black artists would often very much make the point that they are superior than some other Black artists, right? They are more skilled. Like the whole kind of, rap battle culture, right, is born on this fact. And, it's kind of like right now what you see happening in movies, right? Tons of directors are like, you know what? Movies aren't making the same money that they used to. This is a problem. That is a problem. But the real reason I feel like why that is happening is when Hollywood offers nothing of value except, let's say something like a bad drama or a bad superhero film, most kids are going to think, you know what? What's the point of me sitting through a movie and paying for this and doing that when I could just play a video game? Because you're essentially getting the same amount out of it, right? To the extent that video games don't provide any kind of intellectual stimulation and mere entertainment, well, Hollywood doesn't provide intellectual stimulation and only mere entertainment. And yet the entertainment that you could get from something like a video game, it's much more kind of narcotizing than Hollywood. And you could make the same kind of application when it comes to Black culture, right? It's not that necessarily Black pop culture is better, but it is a different angle. It is different. And you do get these kinds of hints of something greater, right? I feel like, a lot of white people, they're seeing, ironically, bits and pieces of what white culture maybe used to be or could be in the future within Black culture, right? If you're a white kid and you're interested in the arts and you want to adjudicate that good or bad, the only place in the world that's telling you right now that you could make this kind of judgment and it's okay, nobody's going to come after you, it's rap, right? Because this is built into rap. Whereas if you're going to go to college and you get a degree and you start talking about good and bad, people don't want to hear from you anymore. So anyway, I just found that an interesting kind of dynamic, right? Like there's lots of reasons why white kids get into a Black culture. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that white culture, the stuff that it's promised, it has never truly borne itself out.
Well, there's two comments. The poem that I think I quoted in the book, The Wigger, was actually about a middle-aged white guy. That has been around for quite a while. These middle-aged white men in the 50s and 60s in the Mad Men kind of era who would go to see Black jazz people and try to empathize there. I think that's something that's a precursor to the 90s millennial wigger thing. And I think that nowadays, the last 4 or 5 years, there's been the bizarre thing of white women making themselves darker skinned on videos on YouTube, including some women like the woman who was white, who pretended she was Black and ran at a local NAACP chapter a few years ago, who was outed. So it's bizarre. It seems, and I could be wrong, you're much more in tune with pop culture nowadays than I am, but it seems that the white male who's obsessed with Black culture has been replaced by white women who have this Earth Mother type thing that I want to help the Negroes. So I'm going to pretend I'm Black and I'm going to suffer because I'm a woman. So I know what sufferance is like. That seems to me where that came from, but I don't know. Anyway, we're going to do Ma'Khia next.
Yeah, let me try to pull this up and hopefully you could hear it. Okay. So this is when he gets out.
Are they going to? Okay, here we go. So here's the cop coming in, and the girl in the pink is the one who's going to almost get stabbed. And here comes Ma'Khia with her other friend. They two flop onto the ground, and she's now here. Okay, just pause that here. So here you can see in the upper left here. Here's the two girls, Ma'Khia. I can't tell which one is which. I think Ma'Khia is on the left. So the cop is saying, "Drop it, drop it." Now he's got a taser, he's got a baton, he's got pepper spray, and he's got a gun. I believe at this point he might already have his gun in one hand, but you can see the two girls are not even looking at the cop. If you look at the direction that they're going, he's coming at them from almost a 90-degree angle. So here's a cop. The girl is focused on it. He should be also trained in basic self-protection, martial arts defense. Okay. Why is he not rushing directly towards the girl with the knife, hitting her from behind? She's not even looking at him. His first, now, if you click it now, you're going to see he at this point, he's going to be yelling something at her, if I remember that.
Yeah, in the original audio, he's just yelling nonstop, and they're literally just completely not paying attention to him at all.
Yeah. So, the girl falls to the ground. Ma'Khia is the girl who's still up. The girl falls to the ground. Ma'Khia is going to flop on her. Now, here, these girls are probably 180 or so pounds, probably 5'2" or 5'3", whatever they are. The cop is still not intervening. He's standing back, letting them go. Now the gun is out. Okay, so maybe he had it out. Maybe he just pulled it out. So why is the gun? Ma'Khia there is the girl with the back. You can see her ass, not the one on the ground. If he had a taser, he could just tase her. If he had a baton, he could just crack her over the head and move in. He's just standing there doing nothing. And now she's going after the pink girl, the girl in the pink, the girl she knocked down. So there's Ma'Khia. Okay, now freeze it there. So you can see, so he's had, now this is probably literally 5 or 6 seconds. But if you get a call, and I believe in the original video, which I watched, which goes a minute or so before he gets there, there's no report of any guns or anything. So if I'm a cop and I've got training and I've got the 3 other things, the pepper spray, the baton, and the taser, why is my first choice going for the gun? Here's a girl with a knife. Now, she's a heavy girl or whatnot, but she didn't try to stab the first girl. She could have easily stabbed the girl who fell onto the grass if she wanted to do damage. Now, I don't know but I've heard things of what they were fighting over a boy or some shit. I don't know. And now Ma'Khia is going after the girl in the pink. But if you have pepper spray probably wouldn't have been good in that case because she had her face to the back or whatnot. But he's a trained cop. He should be able to overpower her. If he has the baton, he could crack her in the head or crack her in the nose or crack her right on the hand to make the knife drop. If you're doing this stuff, and as someone who is in a gang fight or whatnot, the one thing to do is to keep moving. So the cop is moving, but he's not doing that with any pre-planning. He's just trying to basically avoid it. And you can tell from the way he's moving, he's trying to avoid getting hurt himself, even though she's not bearing any threat to him. So she's probably unaware that he's even there, it seems. Why doesn't he use the taser? And especially after she gets up, after the girl falls on the ground, he's right behind her. Literally, if he had his taser ready, he could have tased her. Ma'Khia falls to the ground. And the thing is, if you are being trained, where is the training? That this is how you encounter a situation. He's going to clearly be stronger. He's physically large. You can tell just from the body camera that he's clearly got inches on her. I don't know how many inches. I think he's, from what I saw at the afterwards, he's a good, powerfully built guy. I think he's in his 20s. He's not an old guy. He's a young, robust male. And anyway, there are numbers of things he could have done just in those first few seconds if he, before he pulled up, was just even thinking. If he had the proper training, there's no gun reported. I'm not going to go for the gun. So I'm either going to have one of the three other options ready. Why isn't that ready? Why is he pulling out the gun here?
Yeah. So I mean, at this point is when he shoots her, right? She's just about to stab this other girl.
Yeah.
And people could sort of debate around whether or not like it's ethically sound, whether right now in this moment, several feet of distance, whether it's appropriate to shoot her right now. But the argument that I would make is whatever that you feel about this situation right here, right now, it should have never really gotten there, right? I mean, like you said earlier. So when this is what's happening, and you see that these are, you don't know what's happening on the side, but these two are in an altercation, right? There is supposed to be immediately some kind of intervention at this point. Right.
Here the girl falls down. This girl isn't looking at it. Ma'Khia is the other girl. She's even looking at her. If this guy has this basic training, what he would have done is right there, instead of pulling out the gun, if we went back 5 or 6 seconds in real time there, he should have had the taser ready or the baton.
Yeah.
A baton, a cop's baton is about this long, at least it was. So he's probably talking about 18 inches minimum. You're telling me that a 25, 30-year-old strong, robust cop who's properly trained in good health, a male, with a baton or with a taser, could not have right then. She's disobeying what he's saying. He's perfectly within his rights to clock her over the head or to get her with the taser. Now, I'm not, and like I said earlier in this show, this guy clearly afterwards, he's walking around, he's remorseful. He's saying, but she had a gun. He clearly panicked. He had no plan what to do when he went in. Why is it that? And I think I read that the Columbus police or whatever, they only get 6 weeks of training.
Yeah.
What do they get in Europe? In Europe, they get something like 9 months before you're even put out onto the streets. So he's got probably less than 2 months of training. He's got probably something like 10 to 15% of the training that time-wise that European cops will get. And he's alone in the car. I guess he was the cop closest. We could argue if they needed 2 cops in there. But he's totally unprepared mentally for going into quote unquote battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that the main thing to talk about here, it has to do with the training, right? To your point about Europe versus America, first of all, European cops get more training despite the fact that they are in far, far less dangerous situations, right? In the United States, most likely you have many more reasons to fear not only being a cop, but also being a civilian, right? Being subject to the various whims of cops. I agree with the fundamental analysis that it should have never gotten to this point, right? This could have been short-circuited when it should have been, which is like 5-10 seconds ago, which is why we're here. I mean, do you want to talk about more about this video or tee off on this into like slightly other subjects? Because I want to talk about policing in general as well.
Yeah, but it does bear repeating. Once you see very clearly before he pulls the gun, and maybe he had the gun on his side, but we only see him draw it after that. Right here, when he's coming in, if I'm this cop and I have proper training and I see those 2 girls, the minute I see that Ma'Khia go after the girl, and does she have a knife there? Possibly. I think she does have the knife. She's not looking at it. He could go in, even forgetting the baton, just a good martial arts training, a good kick to the face. Yeah, he might have knocked out a few teeth. Maybe he would have broken her nose, but she'd still be alive.
Yeah. One thing that you said earlier that kind of, do you mind if I stop the share?
Yeah.
One thing that you said earlier that caught my attention was it was something like, if she was white, he would have probably never pulled out the gun.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think this may very well be true, but the way that I normally talk about this, like even if that is in fact the case, instead of like trying to talk about like individual cops and maybe how they would have acted differently had, people's races been inverted in some way, I think it's even more useful to say something like, well, even if we don't know for a fact that this cop would have behaved differently with a white perpetrator versus a black one, we do know that irrespective of this one cop, if this cop were in like 1,000 different situations, or like similar cops were in 1,000 similar situations, we know that overall those outcomes would play out very differently, right? Which is why like so many of the kind of like debates about, was Derek Chauvin actually personally a racist with hatred in his heart? Like that's such a pointless conversation to have. Right. Because as it turns out, he definitely did have lots of like racism within himself. Like there's lots of stuff, in his personal life, how he treated, people at sort of like black venues when he was like a bouncer. So, putting that aside, but, I never really cared too much about personalized, because it always feels like, you're personalizing the argument when you could simply say, well, had 1,000 similar cops been in 1,000 similar situations, just by the way of how we know human behavior falls out, these outcomes would have been different overall, right? Even if individually you could still have the same outcomes again and again.
Well, I mean, I remember when I first saw the video on Quora, there was a guy arguing about the European cops and how differently they treated, and also the thing about white kids, the gun would never have been produced. Clearly, there's not enough training given to cops overall in this country, and especially when they're deployed into situations or areas that have minority people. There is the undoubted tendency to be more definitive. I mean, you could look online, and like I said, you could see white people wielding a machete and cops backing away, giving him, he's on something. There's the infamous video of a black guy who was, I think, a mental health nurse outside trying to calm a white guy who's laying on the ground, and the nurse is and the cops shoot him from 200.
Yeah. They
shoot the black guy who's got his hands up like this, and whether it's Ma'Khia Bryant or that incident, or dozens, if not hundreds, of other videotaped incidents, it's always gun first when it involves a black person. It's always violence first rather than talking to it. And it's just a repeated pattern. And the incompetence of the training only goes so far, though, because, yes, this particular incident, the guy probably was not an out-and-out racist in the Derek Chauvin sense, but there is that immediate pull out the gun when, if he were properly trained, and if this were white people, there would that mechanism to pull out, because he sees two large black females rolling around, then there's something in him that gets scared, and even if that wouldn't apply to this cop, that it would apply to 1,000 other cops in 1,000 other situations like this, right? Like, and I think that always kind of bears repeating, right? Because just too often people want to personalize this stuff to essentially like exonerate cops, right? That happens all the time, right? This guy is good, this guy's bad. It really doesn't even matter, right, what your personal feelings are in so many of these situations, right? It goes beyond the rotten
that.
Barrel. The constabulary in America overall, it's a rotten barrel. It's not that Derek Chauvin or this cop or any other cop is a bad seed. You could say this cop was just a scared, untrained, or unconfident cop. Maybe this was the first time he ever encountered this without a senior buddy in the car. It's the fact that the system is designed because they don't care if innocents get injured. There's the famous video of that old man during the protest last summer, the old guy with the cane who the cops push him to the ground and he hit his head and he almost bleeds out on the ground. They don't care. There's no sense of public service or being a civil servant. It's just utterly gone. The cops think that they can do what they want and without consequences, because they do. And Derek Chauvin aside, we'll see what happens to it with his three buddies. The other girl who in Tennessee, who was shot in her apartment with her boyfriend,
Breonna Taylor.
Yeah. There was absolutely no reason she should have been shot.
Mhm.
There's no reason to. The boyfriend had a gun. Well, a lot of people have guns there because they live in a crime-ridden neighborhood, and they hear people pounding. And like I said in the last time we talked about it, is that only one person out of 15 said the cops identified themselves properly as so. So if I live in a gang-ridden neighborhood, and it could be my enemies,
and much of the time it wouldn't even matter. Like
yeah,
plenty of times you have criminals who are identifying themselves as cops in these neighborhoods to get inside a house if this is like a drug house or whatever.
yeah.
Right.
But again, if that had been some white drug addicts or whatnot, yeah, they would have been. And there's another famous video of a white guy being shot by cops, and people say, "See, white people get shot by cops." Oh, so we have 1,200 videos of black people being abused by cops, but it all balances out because one white guy got wrongly shot. Because one white guy's life is certainly worth as much as 1,200 black people's deaths and suffering. And they don't even realize how bigoted and how myopic that even comparison is.
One thing I'll say about the shootings of white people is this. This isn't to well, let me just put it this way. So recently, there's been all this attention on the shooting of black people, which kind of surprises me because, like, when you think about, like, well, why do things become popular, right, in the imagination? Oftentimes it's because there's some kind of like political expedience. And I guess last year, Democrats tried to like virtue signal about the shooting of unarmed black men as a means of saying, look what's happening in Trump's America. If Biden gets into office, this will never happen, right? And meanwhile, pretty much everything that Democrats said they were going to do in terms of policing, they've sort of, walked back on now. But we do have this phenomenon, right, where there's attention being at least like visibly being paid on black victims. And sometimes you do have, like I've seen things that are basically even more cut and dry and crazier than Derek Chauvin, than this Ma'Khia Bryant. And if it involves a white person, it just gets absolutely no attention. So to give one example, I believe this was like in 2017, or maybe this was like late 2016. There was this like white guy that he was like a window cleaner at a hotel. And I guess he sort of gotten drunk at some point, and then maybe somebody called the cops on him. So you see him in the hotel lobby, just like lying down with his like hands out and his legs out. And the cop is just asking him to do all sorts of really crazy over the top stuff with his hands. Like, put your hand here. Now the other hand, put it behind you. Now lift your leg, 2 inches up, lift the other leg 4 inches up, just like torturing him. And he starts crying and he starts, fearing for his life. And just out of the blue, like one of the cops just like shoots him and kills him. And this is literally, though, an example of a cop on video with his other buddies torturing a guy in the middle of the hotel lobby, and it gets no attention whatsoever. Now, I don't think it's because of these like nefarious reasons that white nationalists want to offer, like, oh, it's because black lives are valued and white lives are not. Clearly, that's not the case. But I think there is something to say for the fact that police brutality against black people is in the public imagination for whatever reason. It seems like nothing is really being done about it, but that's in the imagination. And because you could get headlines based on that, and because you could get attention based on that, and because you could get votes based on that, even if you scare people into voting for Biden over stuff like this, when you have white victims, you're not going to get as much attention, even if numerically, let's say, this sounds crass. I don't mean it that way, but let's say they don't deserve it as much because they're far less victimized. It is the case that white victims will not get the same attention as black victims today, if you're able to catch both on video.
Yes, I know the video you're talking about, the hotel, but by the same token, I've mentioned it in the book, back in the O's when I wrote this book, every time a white woman went missing on a vacation or something, it became worldwide news.
Yes.
And they were all white. They were all blonde. A little black kid is missing. He's not even going to be on a milk crate. But the white girl, there was an epidemic of probably like 5 or 6 white girls over 15 in the O's, where it was on NBC Nightly News, the search for, blonde white girl number 12, so it all depends the situation. And also because he was a white man, and also because he was not, I think that particular video that I think was in Las Vegas, you're right. That guy was not all of his right mind. And it was less having to do with a white guy than that the guy was mentally not there. I believe.
I think he was a window cleaner that just like got a little bit drunk or something, but he was just like on the floor, right, with no, and clearly not a threat to anyone.
Yeah, and that's the way I mean. But anyway, but again, it's one of those things that's an outlier. That again, these few times when a white person was treated like a black person is by people in power. Those few times, you have 150 times many other incidents with black people there, but somehow that balances the scale. Yeah. Again, not realizing just how ridiculous that is.
Yeah.
I stubbed my toe and you called me an asshole. Oh boy, that ranks right up there with the Middle Passage.
Yeah. It's similar to what I said earlier about not in this conversation, but when people especially white people, they often complain about the fact that it's sort of allowed that black people kind of make fun of them, whether it's in comedy or whatever, and white people aren't allowed to respond without getting canceled or facing some other kind of consequences. And what I've often said is the stakes of walking through a black neighborhood and someone shouts at you oh, you white faggot, or whatever the fuck, the stakes are just so incredibly low, right? Because when you're done with that kind of interaction, you simply get to go home to your house, to your family, to your neighborhood, and not deal with shit, right? Whereas, the stakes of racial language against non-whites, just historically speaking, right? It has, it implies many more things of actual everyday material reality that goes beyond the equivalent of, oh, somebody called me a moron. I mean, who actually cares about that?
It goes back to when I've been arguing with people on Facebook about the neighborhood I grew up in. One guy was he put up a video from 1960 where they integrated schools in Glendale, New York, and saying, see, we were integrated schools 5 or 6 years before the rest of the city. We're not bigots or whatnot. We're not shouting at little girls. We're not burning down churches like in Selma, Alabama. And I'm like, yeah. Wow. So you have one video where the people are being interviewed by a news crew and they're on their best behavior. But we're not going to talk about all those times, like I said, when neighbors would knock on the door. There are Negroes in the neighborhood. Lock your doors. Countless times, and countless page 47 black people being beaten or killed in 1968 or 1974 that were never reported. But this was before mass media, and it became quote unquote sexy to lead news because it bleeds.
Do you want to talk about the ways that white people get used racially, in the media or in politics, or by the culture, maybe last 10, 20 years?
Just so we only have about 10, 15 minutes to go. So it depends on what the time is.
I'll maybe just some brief comments on that, I guess. Cause for example, we mentioned that a white guy that got tortured and shot by those cops in the hotel lobby. I feel like when there's examples like that available for white people to, pluck and to discuss, white people would often say, see, white people deal with this all the time as well. It's very disingenuous to say that only happens to black people, blah, blah, blah. A lot of this strikes me as just another way of just separating people, right? Because on the one hand, you could understand human resentment, where you see someone getting tortured and he gets no attention, and you think, I wonder why that is, right? The most obvious reason being that the person is white. And then on the other hand, you have conservatives who are swooping in and, either trying to, run cover for cops, or, saying that nothing needs to actually change. But I'm just seeing, just like, basically the point is, I'm just seeing just being used as useful idiots, right, for all sorts of things that they themselves don't understand. You see this yourself, like in some of the people that you work with, white people that aren't really racist, but they're voting for Trump. Just what have you been noticing, like, on that front, right? Because it's just a very kind of disturbing trend where, white people are kind of disconnecting from politics, Black people are as well, and just a lot of this kind of like wedges being put in the center.
I mean, I don't know if I'm not as in tune with that stuff as you are. I do know a couple of days ago, the big video that went viral was of that Fox News asshole Tucker Carlson getting confronted by a white fellow in Montana, and saying, the white fellow said, you're the worst human being in the world. I should kick your ass. And then 24, 40 hours later, Tucker Carlson came out with, one of those replies, if they hadn't been filming on the phone, I would have really gotten out of control and kicked his ass and whatnot. And it's like, this is, and then Carlson saying, this wouldn't have happened if I was a Black commentator, if I had been Don Lemon or something, and it's like, this is what these kinds of morons think deserves some kind of politicization or racializing, is that a guy who's basically a race-mongering guy, whose whole fortune, his whole celebrity is built upon playing upon this, just like an Ann Coulter who tweeted a few years ago on applause for the church bombing, or the temple, the Jewish bombing in Pittsburgh, and I got banned from Twitter because I called her a cunt, if I can say that word. But then Tucker, this is right up there with Ma'Khia Bryant's shooting. That Tucker Carlson got confronted by a white Montanan who called him out for his political bigotry. This probably got more airplay than Ma'Khia Bryant's shooting. That in and of itself says the state of how Black people are devalued in this country. It's become an absurdity.
Yeah, I remember when that guy Coleman Hughes, in lesser form, he said something like, well, we talk about, discrimination against Blacks in employment and so on and so forth, but what about the fact that singer Rihanna decided to use only Black dancers in one of her videos or something? And it's like, who gives a shit? Like, this is such a something that literally never ever happens in any other situation, right? These are the stakes.
Rihanna employing Black dancers, or Black people being sold at slave markets for 250 years. What boy, the absolute scale of the way these mindsets work. Boy, there were three white dancers who were just as good as the Black dancers. Rihanna's a racist.
Or for people that believe that slavery is too far away and too distant to discuss. Well, what about the fact that right now, I mean, if you look at any studies on employment applications and stuff like that, if you have a Black photo, right, versus a white person or Black name, or like a white person or a white person's photo, whatever, you have like a 30% difference, right, in getting called up, even if qualifications are identical.
And it's funny because that cable news guy, I saw a thing that John Oliver, I don't know what show he's on, I saw like 2-minute rant where he said, fuck reparations for slavery. We should pay reparations to Black people today for what they are going through today. For Black people, for being Black people today, should get reparations for all the shit they get. They should, get a $10,000 a year subsidy just for having to deal with that shit.
Yeah. I guess we could close out a little bit on cops. I agree. Cops are still out of control. Specifically, I remember during coronavirus, the only people in my neighborhood that were not wearing masks were cops.
Yeah.
whether or not they would go into like inside a store, like the 7-Eleven, you know, locally, like it says the same thing for everybody. Mask required inside. One time I go inside there, I see two cops like laughing it up without masks. And for whatever reason, the workers behind the glass panel, they suddenly have their masks off too, almost as if they were pressured to take off their masks when the cops entered. I walk by to Home Depot and I pass by this police precinct, and always it's like 30 fucking cops, just like the equivalent of like, you know how like in King of the Hill you have those like guys like standing around just like drinking beer. They're fucking doing the same thing except with cigarettes, all maskless, like fucking breathing on each other, coughing on each other, sneezing on each other. And like for anybody that's like against this idea, like all cops are bastards, if you think that's not a useful lens to view policing through, think about the fact that, you know, in that one example of all those cops standing around this one precinct, which one of those cops is not a bastard, right? Because if you're not a bastard, you'd be out there shouting like, you can't fucking do this. Not only is this unethical, it's also against the very regulations that Bill de Blasio put out. Everybody has to be wearing a mask, especially cops who must be modeling this kind of behavior, right? But, you know, nobody does it. Then they get upset when you sort of generalize against everybody. But the generalization works because in any situation where the stakes are high, where things actually matter, the cops that could actually do something to prevent something bad from happening never do. So you have to put them in the same category.
And the
right?
few that the few that might are the Serpicos, and they usually end up leaving the force. And you know, Serpico himself said that he suffered from a lot of mental stress. I guess you call it PTSD. And you know, he sort of has gone a little wacky in the head on some issues in later years. I don't know if that's with Alzheimer's or with just PTSD or whatnot. So you're gonna be, if you are a cop who's a reformer who doesn't want to do things, even if you're a cop of color, you're gonna go along with the way, because it is a rotten barrel. That's what this should be. The title, you should have the rotten barrel of the constabulary.
Yeah, that's a much more useful way of viewing things than a rotten apple, right? Because a rotten apple is just so like, you know, it wants to deny what's actually happening right underneath it all.
Yeah.
But anyway, this was good. Perhaps we'll close it here. I will actually put Dan Schneider's email address into the description under this video. So if you guys want to email him and get a copy of this book, please do so. If you haven't hit like, please do so. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And again, whether
the book is on Amazon too.
Oh, it is on Amazon. Okay, so you could actually, okay, so I'll put the link on Amazon. And if you guys are listening to this as a podcast in one of the audio platforms, you could view this on YouTube on the Automachination YouTube channel, and vice versa. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll come up with something soon. I'll have a video with Ethan Pinch a few days from now, so you guys will get another upload soon after this.
Oh my God.